It's Rawze here, and I'm rebuilding my truck and truck engine. This is not a professional video series. Do not follow this to rebuild the engine in your truck. I'm just going to give that warning right up front. I'm not a professional. This isn't a how-to. I'm just making video on rebuilding my own truck and how I would go about it for myself. If you need an engine rebuild or you want to do any of this kind of work, I would seriously hope you would seek a professional and do it according to the manuals in the books. Okay, I'm ready to do my main bearings, and I've never done this before. I thought I'd talk about it in a minute. What I was told and recommended by from a few people is that the main bearing bolts, they're 24 millimeter. They're quite large. I don't know if you can grab the camera real quick, and I'll show that. Okay, when you do these bearings, the torque on this, when you take them out and you put it back in, we're going to do one at a time. When you take this out and you get the bearing out and you go to torque it back, you initially tighten both bolts to 150 foot-pounds with a wrench. Okay, and that's not unreasonable. You can do that with your hands. And then once you set them both at 150, it seats everything. Then the book says to back off one bolt at a time, so we'll back this one off, and then we'll get all the tension off of it, and then we'll bring it back to 110 foot-pounds. So you torque it to 110 foot-pounds and you stop. And then we'll do this one, we'll back it off, and then we'll run it back in and torque it to 110 foot-pounds. And then what we'll do is we'll mark the socket or we'll mark the bolt, and the book says to move the bolt 180 degrees after you've torqued it to 110. And I'm going to tell you something, that's going to be 400 or 500 foot-pounds. I mean, it's going to be a lot of torque. It's going to be really hard to do. And unless you have some really 3-foot or 4-foot long wrenches, or bars and sockets and extensions, or a torque amplifier, working upside down, that's all very difficult. We're just going to use the air gun to bring it that 180 degrees. And I really don't like air tools, but that's what we're going to do because we're working upside down, and it's so difficult when you do this upside down. So that's what we're going to do, and we're going to do one at a time just so that we're very safe and we don't have anything try to come down. We don't stress the face bearing, the face seal on the crank. You start taking 2 or 3 of these loose and it starts to stress the face seal. The crank wants to start coming down. If this is a very dangerous job. I mean, that crank can fall on you. I mean, it could kill you and crush you. This is nothing to play with here. So we're going to completely take our time, and we're going to just do one at a time completely, one at a time completely, one at a time completely. And I couldn't find any clearance spec on this, but my engine's not worn out. So the way the procedure is in the book, you pull the bearing and then you mic the new bearing to make sure that it's 0.127, I think it is. Yes. 0.127 thickness with a set of calipers or mics. And if you get the new bearings from Cummins themselves, I've never seen where they're wrong or they're out of spec. So a lot of guys, when they get the bearings from Cummins themselves, they'll pull the old bearing out, they'll just put the new bearing in, and they'll torque it all down. Well, if you've got a lot of wear in your crank, or if you're using aftermarket bearings or some other company's bearings or whatever, you need to not only mic the bearing to make sure the bearing's the correct thickness, but you should also use what's known as plastic gauge to put up in here. And what you do is you put the upper bearing in, you put the lube on it, and then you put the lower bearing in without the lube in it. You put the plastic gauge in, you tighten everything down to 150 foot-pounds. Here's some plastic gauge, okay? And then, there's no spec in the book on this because it's not part of the procedure. But if you got a worn crank, you're going to want to know what this clearance is. So you put it together, you torque it down to 150, and then you take it apart again, and then you use your plastic gauge set to see how much clearance there is between the bearing and the crank itself. And most of the older Cummins engines are between 2 and 5 thousandths for here. So I would imagine that you'd want between 2 and 5 thousandths. A lot of engines are between 2 and 5 thousandths on the crank bearings. So you would probably want to see roughly that on a plastic gauge if your crank is worn out, and you want to see how bad it really is. But my engine's not really worn out, so we're not going to bother to plastic gauge it. We're just going to replace it with Cummins certified bearings like most of the shops will do. And then what we're going to do though is we're going to turn this thing by hand before. We're going to replace the bearings, and then we're going to turn it by hand after to make sure it didn't get really tight, because that's what we're going to do. We're going to do it by feel instead. And a lot of mechanics do it that way. A lot of shops do it that way. You know, like I say, you can plastic gauge it if you want to, and go down and do every one of them. Now, if I pull one of these and I see that there's a lot of wear on the bearing, there's a lot of copper showing, or there's a lot of, you know, you see that it's really worn, obviously we're going to plastic gauge that, you know, and we're going to go ahead and do that process. But since my engine is really not that worn out, I mean, it's really in good shape, I think what we're going to find is we're just going to put new bearings in there, and you know, we're not going to have any trouble with that. So that's the way we're going to do it here. We're going to use an air tool, which I really don't like using air tools, but in this situation, it's warranted, it's necessary, it's the best process possible. I've been looking into, you know, using a jack and a torque amplifier and long bars, and it's no. We're just gonna do this job, because I need to get my truck back on the road. What do you think? So let's get started. Let me show how I got one of them loose without an air tool. It would take forever this way, but I can do it. And this is with my 3/4 ratchet. Here's my 3/4 ratchet, and I've got a torque amplifier in here with a bar. And I've got a little jack to hold everything up, and then of course I'm on one of the bolts for the main bearings. Like I say, those are some seriously high torque bolts. So we can just take our ratchet here. We just take our ratchet here and turn this thing. Oh yeah, it'll break it loose with the torque amplifier. So that's one way you can do it if you absolutely had to. You were by yourself. We're gonna get a little lazy under here because we're working upside down. Everything wants to fall into your face. These tools are heavy. So this is one of those situations where you take advantage of that, definitely. Anyways, I figured I'd show that on YouTube. Let's go get some air tools.